So now we're going to talk about a different topic, the communication and meetings, and the steps that I will talk about in later, and you saw in your guide. A lot of the things Jim already talked about for the AdCom, but here's more systematically been drilled down for you, so I can go a little bit quicker at the end. The meetings, I think, are very important. There are four kinds of, they call it in the four kinds of meetings and communication that you can have with the FDA. Administrative meetings, and I will go in all of them. I'll go give a little bit more examples and show what they are. Regulatory communications, and it can be both FDA initiated or company initiated. Product application meetings, the AdCom is one of them for that one, and then public administrative proceedings. Type of meetings that are, or the groups of meetings that are. Let's start with that first, and then we go to the steps that can be given for that. Administrative meetings usually are ad hoc meetings, private two-way communications. So and it can be by telephone, email most of the time. Can be face-to-face, but usually is not for this kind of meetings. Examples are, for instance, discussion on the status of the sponsor application. Just a question to the project manager in the FDA asking, okay, where are we? Can we get some more questions, or can we expect some more questions, or is this it? Was this it? Dispute resolution is another one. You can just ask, okay, how are we going to do this? So try to organize things. You usually do this via this kind of meetings. The FDA can decide to make this public, but usually it's more a private conversation between the two parties, and there will be a summary of it. So any FDA communication you will have, you'll see that returning coming back, there will be a summary, either minutes, but there will be a summary coming back, and that can be private also, but a summary has been made so the FDA knows what has been said and what they either agreed on or what they promised to you. The second group of communications are regulatory communications, and the first two that you see here are FDA initiated, and those are regulations which are binding. So whatever a regulation is, you have to follow basically, and there's guidances and recommendations. The FDA's basically put those out to give a little bit more guidance on what you should do, what you could do, or what you should do. They're not binding. You can follow them. If you don't want to follow them, you have to give a good reason, because the FDA expects that you have read those guidances. If you develop a drug, you read the guidance about it. If you follow them, they say, great, you did a good job. If you don't follow them for a specific reason, and there's always, your drug is always special, there's always a good reason why you don't follow the guidance, then you should give that, get reason to them, and they can either agree or disagree with you. Then the other four that are on the slides, the citizen petition and the suitability petition, special protocol assessment, and drug designations are usually sponsor initiated. A citizen's petition is basically asking for a change in health policy. Suitability petition is asking the FDA if you can file an abbreviated NDA for a product that is not exactly similar to a product that is already on the market, where they have the NDA for. And then the special protocol assessment is if you want to get an agreement with the FDA on your protocol, that your protocol suffices basically the regulations for getting approval. And the FDA, with a SPA, the FDA usually agrees to that if your trial fulfills what you set out to be doing, you can get approval with that. It's a bit tricky because that interpretation of that you fulfill all the needs of the SPA is usually a disputed thing between the FDA and the sponsor. Whereas the sponsor thinks, well, we did everything we asked what we said in the trial to be doing. And the FDA said, yeah, but. And then they have some reasons why they don't think they should fulfill. And then you can go to an AdCom to discuss that and get the public opinion about that. Drug designations, very important. Usually the sponsor initiate that and ask for it. Breakthrough therapy, fast track, or orphan drug. There's special rules for it, how you can ask for these kind of things. The FDA sent out guidances for this. So if you think you fulfill one of the guidances, you ask for this kind of special designations because it gives you advantages. So the breakthrough therapy designation, for instance, you get more regular contact with the FDA to how to develop things. You can get advice on what kind of trials you should do and how you should do them. For your filing, usually you get priority review filing, so you can get a shorter timeline to get it registered. So there's a lot of things that you can get with this kind of designation. So if you fulfill the criteria that are in the guidances, you usually ask for this kind of thing. Orphan drug is if it's for a small indication, so less than 200,000 patients have the disease, then you can ask for an orphan drug designation. A lot of oncology products have that, for instance, and especially for those very high-priced drugs, they ask for the orphan drug, and then they get some sort of advantages for that. There's also types of meetings. So the product-specific application meetings are between a sponsor and the FDA, and there's 4 types of them, A through C. There's an extra one. Recently, the FDA has included also the type B end of phase meeting in there. It's not in your book at this moment. It needs to be updated for the next version. But the type B AOP is also there now in the guidances that I have given out. And I will go through all of them in a little bit more detail. I think this is important because those are the things that you have to, if you ask for a meeting with the FDA, this is the one thing that you really have to be concerned with. Type A meetings are for the serious things that you have in your product development. So if there's a safety issue coming up, or if your product development is stalled for one or other reason, or is on clinical hold, that sort of things are being discussed in a type A meeting. The FDA has to grant that within 30 days of you're requesting that meeting, and it's a very quick process, basically. So for type A meetings, if you request them, be prepared to go quickly to the FDA. You don't have much time. And especially putting a briefing book together and some questions or some answers to the questions, just be prepared to it and make sure that you're ready for it. But again, there for a safety issue, you have to be quick also. You cannot stall that, because if the FDA finds out later on that you waited 3 months to come to them, they're going to be very angry with you. And that's the one thing you don't want to do with the FDA. You don't want to anger them. You don't want to frustrate them by being late. As Jim said, being honest with them is the best way to get a good relationship with them. And that's one of the steps also in the how you can get a good outcome. Type B meetings are usually granted within 60 days. Still important meetings like the pre-IND, the pre-NDA meeting or BLA meetings. So it's still important, but it can wait a little bit. So that's why the FDA have said, well, this is type B. Within 60 days, you get a meeting, and then you go from there. Meetings regarding REMS or post-marketing requirements, but then outside of the context of your application. So if you have submitted already something, you don't have to go for a type B meeting to discuss your post-marketing requirements. That goes in basically in the discussions you have about the submission itself and the deficiencies there. Type B, end of phase, well, as the term already says, is end of phase meetings. So usually it's end of phase 1, 2, or 3, or pre-phase 2, 3 meetings. So those are the meetings that you have with them to discuss what the data is and the further development. So after phase 1, you're going to discuss what your phase 2 is going to be based on your phase 1 data. After your phase 2, you're going to discuss basically what your phase 3 is going to be. And then you could have also a pre-phase 3 meeting, because usually there's a little bit of a time in between where you develop your protocol, you get some input from your physicians, and if that input is slightly different than what the FDA have given you, you go back for a pre-phase 3 meeting to make sure that your phase 3 trial will lead in the end to an approval. And again there, keep the FDA abreast of everything you're doing in your development program, be it devices or drugs, it doesn't matter. and the FDA is a much happier friend to you and will help you in getting a product approved. Even if there's safety aspects that maybe are not that comfortable to you or to the FDA, they will help you overcome that, and they help you either with a restricted indication or with a restricted patient population to make sure that you can get a product to the market when it's important for patients that they get that product or device. And then type C meetings are the other meetings that are not type A or B. They don't really describe what type C is. It's more anything else, basically. And they'll be granted within 75 days. Oh, and I forgot to mention that the type B end of phase is granted within 70 days. So it's slightly different than type B. That was 60 days, this is 70 days. And type C is 75 days. It's still a reasonable time frame. It's about 2.5 months. But it can be scheduled a little bit differently. And type C, I give one example in the book also here, is just early consultations to make sure that a biomarker can be used as a primary endpoint in one of your studies, if that biomarker has never been used before to get a product approved. FDA is very much into biomarkers. They would like to use those because they can get earlier signals, and earlier signals means that they can get earlier approvals. And as you know, with the whole initiative of getting drugs earlier and device earlier approved than before, we need to go to not the endpoints that we classically had, but also to biomarkers. If you ask for a meeting, it always needs to be a written request. If it's this kind of type of meeting. An update on where you are in your application, you can just call the project manager. But if you go specifically for a type A, type B meeting, you definitely have to send in a written request with a lot of general stuff like the product name and application number. That's not that important. The most important thing is, of course, is why you want to have this meeting. You have to explain that, and what are your questions. They would like to know what your questions are. If it's for a type A meeting, so for a safety issue or clinical hold, they would like to have your rationale why you would like to have the meeting. Any other meeting, the FDA basically will determine what kind of meeting it will be. It's going to be a B or C. But according to the guidances, you know already what it's going to be. So you don't have to mention that. You also suggest who you want to have there from the FDA. And that's something that is important for them to know also, so they can assess if those people have time in the coming month or months to have the meeting with you. And then, of course, the meeting format, and I will come back to what meeting formats there are and when you can use them. Components of the meeting package. So if the FDA has granted you a meeting, let's say a type B meeting, you have to put a briefing package together so you can ask all the questions again, but you have to give also then the background data. So why do you ask this question? What is the background data that you have? And what is your suggested solution? And usually the question you ask then, does the FDA agree with? That's usually the first couple of words that you start your question with, and then they can simply say yes or no. It's very simple. You don't ask open questions, what do the FDA think? That's more of a discussion point. Usually the FDA has more difficulty answering those kind of things, but ask closed questions. Does the FDA agree with? And then it's going to be very simple, yes or no. Then the meeting formats, usually it's a face-to-face that you would like to have for this kind of meetings, so you can see what they're saying and how they're saying it. Sometimes if you have a lot of team members throughout the country or maybe even overseas, you want to have them teleconferencing. You can also ask for a teleconference if necessary. And the written response only basically is only for type B and C meetings. Type A meetings always have a sort of verbal component in there. There's always a communication that's either by telephone or face-to-face. The face-to-face, if you ask for a face-to-face or a teleconference, it could well be that it turns out after the FDA internal meeting, it turns out that they answer all your questions. You said, does the FDA agree? And the FDA said to all your questions, yes. With this short rationale usually, but they say yes to everything. then there's no need to hold a meeting anymore. So the internal meeting from the FDA, that's why also you have to send the briefing package always a week or 2 weeks before, so the FDA has enough time to look through it, assess it, does an internal meeting to align the whole team there and make sure that they can give you a feedback. And then you have time, when you see their feedback coming back, you have time to decide whether or not you want to hold that meeting or not. So you can always cancel a meeting that you have requested. If you think that if they answer everything with no, there's also probably not a real reason to go for that meeting anymore. You have to rethink your strategy then. If there's 1 or 2 things that they said no, but they gave a rationale that you think, oh, okay, we have some arguments there, we can make some arguments, we can still convince them, then you go to a meeting, and especially face-to-face then, to try to convince them and see it your way. But otherwise, you can always cancel it. The meetings itself, FDA is in charge of it. So they're chairing the meeting, although if they say, well, now we go into the questions, then the sponsor is leading it usually. They said, okay, we have this question, we want to discuss this is our argumentation, what do you think of it? And then you have a discussion with that, and then you go to 2 or 3 questions that you have still. Usually there's no presentation being given, it's more an open discussion, that's what the FDA also wants. Sometimes, to make your point clear, we'd like to show a couple of slides and say, okay, well, this is a point that we really want to get your agreement on, how we should go further with this. This is what we think, and you put it on a couple of slides so they can look at it and they can see. You have to mention that up front to them or before the meeting so they can make provisions, because some of the rooms don't even have a projector in there. Just a big table with a lot of chairs around it. And it's pretty cramped in those rooms. There's no video or audio taping allowed in those rooms. So these are really private meetings. Yes, there will be always minutes. As I said, every meeting with the FDA will have some minutes coming out, but there's no recording. So what you do basically is you take notes. Make sure that you capture what has been said. And that's one of the steps that we come back to later. If you are in these meetings, make sure that you take notes and refer back to the FDA. Is this what I heard? Is that correct? So, sorry, there's 2 meetings that have not been mentioned in the book that I just remembered this morning when we were sending the presentation. Just during the application, is if you have submitted until the PDUFA date, basically, there's 2 extra meetings in there, the mid-cycle meeting and a late-cycle meeting for the drugs. Devices I will come to later. But for the drugs, there's a mid-cycle meeting and a late-cycle meeting. And those 2 meetings will give you hints on what the FDA think of your application. So at the mid-cycle meeting, they will let you know what the major review issues are and how they're going to deal with it. So usually there's a communication, a day 74 letter. Before that, they let you know if that there might be or might not be an AdCom. At the mid-cycle meeting, they let you know if there's enough major issues that they would like to discuss at an AdCom. And then the late-cycle meeting is just confirming what they have received from you up to that moment, and basically going more or less through the agenda for the AdCom. Or if you don't have an AdCom, the late-cycle meeting is, okay, these are the things that still need to be discussed before we can approve you. And usually that's labeling, and they highlight then what kind of labeling discussions they would like to have with you. So those 2 kind of meetings, the mid-cycle and the late-cycle meeting, you could get questions about that in your exam. So look it up in the guidances that have been quoted in the book also. They are there in those referenced. Then for the devices, it's slightly different. So they have a pre-submission meeting, or before the submission, a pre-submission meeting. That's done for the investigational device exemption. So when you start with your device, basically, you can have a meeting with them on how you're going to go further with it, what you're going to do further, what your development program is. And you can get feedback and input in that. And then there are during your development program, what they call then early collaboration meetings. An agreement meeting and determination meeting. Agreement is more, so what are the investigational planned parameters that you have to put in your program to make sure that you can get some positive results out of there. And determination meetings are there if you're going to prove the endpoint that you have said you're going to prove is that scientific valid for an approval. So those are the two meetings that you have before you even submit your data with the FDA. And then during your submission, so there's no mid-cycle and late-cycle meeting basically, but after 90 days after your submission, they give you a deficiency letter basically. So what are the deficiencies in your PMA? And then the sponsor can request meetings, so what they call issue meetings, submission issue meetings, to discuss how you can overcome those issues and what you need to do. And then there's a PMA day 100 meeting. That's where you discuss the review status. So you first get day 90, you get your letter of deficiencies, and day 100 is, okay, what are we going to do further? How are we going to go from here? And then it's going to be, is it going to be a 180-day process, so without an AdCom, or is it going to be a 320-day process with AdCom? And then there's public administrative proceedings that the FDA can organize. The advisory committee, meaning the AdCom, is one of them. And Jim talked about that a lot already. Then there's a public regulatory hearing where they go into more advice seeking from the public. That's why it's more open. They want to have doctors in there. They want to have patients and organizations in there. They get input on their policies and strategies. And a public workshop is to share and gather information on what they have seen so far. Those are things that regularly happen, and some of the advisory committee meetings are also more or less the public workshops that they organize. Then the Board of Inquiry and Evidentiary Hearing, those are meetings that are pretty rare. You don't see those too often happening. That's more if there's a real medical or scientific issue that they would like to discuss in public. I haven't seen that too much happening. And also the evidentiary hearing is something that apparently is mandated by Congress and the FDA commissioner to discuss public health concerns about a product. Again, there I've also not seen that. What I've seen happening is a public hearing from the RAC, and that was more in Europe, where they discussed more an overall strategy for a safety product, and that's what's happening in the US also with some of the FDA, where they talk about more in the AdCom, more in the general forms of a specific drug or drug class safety aspect, and they can have that. As I said, the steps have been discussed and are applicable also to the AdComs. So you will see a lot of similar things happening here, but these are more on the FDA meetings. So not specifically to the AdCom, but more on the FDA meetings. And it gives you structure basically on how you also should approach AdComs, but also other FDA meetings. And we think that all these meetings should be approached more or less very similar. You should prepare for them. You should know what you should do. And one of the things that George Bernard Shaw said, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. So be sure that you communicate what you want to communicate and ask feedback, that they heard what you said. So that's what they do. So know your audience. Jim said for the AdCom, know what the AdCom panel members is. In an FDA meeting, your audience is the FDA. And what I can tell you about the FDA are, this is what the influence, we know what the audience needs to be influenced. We know from the FDA, those are science-based people. They're not fooling around. They read the data, they interpret the data, and the FDA does even their own analyses. And that you sometimes see that reflected also in briefing books from the FDA for the AdCom, where they did their own analysis with different numbers. So the numbers are different, they did their own analysis. They excluded some patients because they thought it was not applicable, and that's fine. They're focused on public health. So know your audience there, make sure that you're done. And they're part of a bureaucracy. So they don't like to change too much, but they will if necessary. So if you have good arguments, please use it and help them change for the better. There's a constant changing of the environment, of course, and FDA has to adapt to that. It will do slowly, but it will adapt. And especially standard of care for drugs and devices and diseases, how things are being treated, they will adapt to it because they approved stuff, so the next time they have to take that in consideration, of course. Anything that is not approved is not in the vision of the FDA, basically. It cannot be a standard of care, unless it's very old products. But the newer products that have been approved or not approved, they're not part of the standard of care, even if doctors are using it. They don't see it as standard of care. But Congress and the White House, of course, have a big influence on FDA too. That's why we have this whole initiative now of getting drugs quicker approved. Because that's what Congress and White House want them to do. So they're looking into ways of streamlining the process, of getting it quicker to the market. But they're running into problems, especially with safety. Because they still have to safeguard the US people, of course. They cannot just approve drugs and they'll say, oh, yeah, well, yeah, we need to do it quicker. So that's why we take some more risks. No, the risks need to be very similar still, but it needs to go quicker. There's a lot of pressure from patient groups and public to get drugs quicker to the market or quicker available. Sometimes even before they're going to be approved. HIV, of course, was a very good example 10 years ago. They were shouting, we need to have these products approved now. Yeah, but they are in phase 1. We don't care. Our people are dying. We need to have them now. So they have adapted to that. There are rules and regulations on how they can make them available. And that took a little bit of time and a lot of public pressure, but it worked. So that those kind of things can work and will work. And of course, the media plays a role. Although nowadays I'm not quite sure what I should believe for the media anymore, but the media plays a role, of course, in their stories that they bring out and on how patients are being treated or not being treated. And the high price of drugs, of course, is something definitely that the media brings about. Weekly you see stories about this, people that cannot afford it or can afford it. And it's also not only in the lay press, but also in the journals that I'm reading for the oncology, for instance, where, as you pointed out very pointedly, is the really high prices of some of the drugs, especially CAR-Ts. Those kind of things are really very expensive and bringing people in troubles. That sort of things will be heard by the FDA, and that's also why Jim said they're changing. Previously, no discussion about pricing. Nowadays, it's okay, but is this only for the happy few, or is it for everybody that fits this indication? Step 2 is know the issue. Very clear, you need to know the issues. You need to know what the FDA tells you. Read not only the letters, but also read between the lines. Most of the time, FDA is very good in telling you what their issues are specifically, but then they don't know exactly what they can ask from you, how to solve it. So read them between the lines and make sure that you know that. So pay attention to FDA's written responses. They remember what they've said. Even if sometimes you don't want to remember it, they do, and they will feed it back to you. Review relevant FDA precedents and actions on similar issues that were yours. Because the FDA has all that in mind. So if it's public, please take note of it. And sometimes the FDA has way more information than you have. If you develop a product or a device which has several other companies also in the same sort of class in development, the FDA will have knowledge of all those products. you probably don't have that much knowledge, but if you can get knowledge out of literature, please use that to your good and see what kind of issues there are. Consider also policy changes, and as I said also, recent publications or new drugs are coming out. FDA will listen to it. FDA will also know if those new products are under review at that moment, and that could change the policy, especially if the results are so outstanding that we see, for instance, in CAR T cells. Step 3, for every meeting, set a goal. Don't think, oh, it's just a type B meeting, we wing that. Set a goal, an outcome very clear, you have a set of goals there, you want to get your drug approved, it's very clear what you need to do to get that goal. But in your type A, B, or C meeting, make sure that you have also a goal there, that you're there. And not only look at your reality, but also see what the FDA might think about it. And that makes it more a two-way stream, and you can easier have a communication then. If they are over here and you're over here, it's much less easy to talk about it than if you're on equal level, and then there's a good communication happening. So for every inter-asking, ask yourself, what am I trying to accomplish here? And what is my win for it? But I also would say, what is the win for the FDA from it, or the patient? So just think about those things when you set your goal. And then link all your preparation to that goal. Step 4, know the company's position. It's important that you as a team work together, of course. Most of the time, there's registration teams and development teams. Work together with that, come to a similar conclusion as a team, and then make sure that your company is aware of that. And they either have to adapt to what the situation is because you have analyzed the data, you've made that position, but make sure that your company is aware of that position. Because it could have major consequences, of course, whatever the outcome of the FDA is. Provide, step 5, provide pertinent meeting materials. For the outcome, very clear, it's a briefing book. For a meeting, make sure that you're focused on what the issues are. FDA, usually it's a 1-hour meeting. That's the whole meeting. So you have to answer some questions there with them, but make sure that you're aware of what you're going to provide them. Don't provide there your whole NDA or clinical summary of all the trials. If there's only one problem in one trial, focus on that one. If there's a safety issue, provide all the data for that safety issue, but not for the rest of your safety. You don't have to convince them at that moment that they should approve your drug. It's usually an issue meeting that you go for and concentrate on that issue. So focus questions, the sponsor's position, outline of the product data that you have for that specific issue, and then of course also your recommendation. Does the FDA agree with? So not only post there the issue, but provide your solution also. FDA likes that. They like better to say, no, we don't like your solution, then they have to come up with their own solution. And also sometimes you don't like their solutions. They might be very flung away. So guide them in a certain direction, and then you can have a discussion about it. Anticipate concerns and interests. So when you know your audience, you know what the FDA is, and sometimes you have some information already about your division and who the people are in that division. If you have that, that's great, because then you can anticipate what they're going to say already about those issues. During the AdCom, but also during the any other meeting, it's a wrong time for an original thought. So try to prepare with all the information in the back of your mind, and also all the issues. Don't try to hide anything, think, oh, that's not coming up. Bring it open in the team, discuss it, and prepare eventuality answers for that. Most likely questions, as Jim said, responder, create the answer, and then practice. So don't forget that. It's not only creating an answer and then say, oh, okay, that's it. No, practice, practice, practice. Make sure that you get it in your head. That if that question comes up, that you can quickly answer it. Identify the responder also, that you know who's going to answer it. Not only that, but it also determines who's your team that you're going to take with you to the FDA. And that could be, per issue can be different. If it's a pharmacology issue, of course you bring a pharmacologist, but maybe you also need some statistical help with that. Statistician come also. And that is when you try to get all the questions out there, you know who you have to bring to answer the questions. So prepare for it. Be organized. Slightly different here than for an AdCom. There you have your framework already. This is an hour meeting. And you need to solve all your questions that you ask them. You should not leave anything open. So manage the meeting time carefully. And there should be one lead there from you that in the team that makes sure that you stay on time, that you not have one issue solved, but there's 5 unsolved. Doesn't help you. Usually the FDA doesn't give you more time. They have other meetings scheduled thereafter. So bring the appropriate people. We said that if you have the questions laid out, you know what the appropriate people are to answer those. And then of course provide the necessary clarification to the FDA. If you can't do that, don't go to the meeting. So please make sure that you're prepared for giving them extra information than what you've already given them, so that they can make an informed decision whether or not to agree with you. Adequately prepare for the meeting. What we usually suggest is for every meeting, conduct in-role practice sessions. So it's not only answering the question and practice for yourself, but with the team. Because you go there as a team. Everybody needs to be involved with that. Deliver concise and credible messages. Address both known and potential FDA issues. So think of those of things that the FDA could bring up during the discussion. Think of what you would like to say then. And then, especially during the practices, establish boundaries for acceptable activities. So within every company has their own set of boundaries that you have. Some companies can say, oh, we can do a phase 4, that's no problem at all. Some other companies say, let's talk about this. And if you come across those kind of issues, discuss those up front before you go to the FDA, so you have your answer ready. When the FDA comes and says, well, we think you should do a phase 4 study or a post-marketing study, you know the answer already. And you can say to the FDA what you have decided already, with the company backing, of course. Usually when you go to the FDA, you don't have your CEO with you to discuss financial stuff. So you go with a team that is knowledgeable about the issue, but not about a broader thing. So make sure that you have those already clarified before you go to the FDA. And then the last couple of minutes, and also in the trainings, but also during the FDA, always look for pathways for follow-up discussions. So if you get agreement on everything, it's fine, but it rarely happens. Usually there's a discussion. Sometimes you have to go back to get some new data because they ask you something that you haven't thought of, and that's possible also. So always make sure that you have a couple minutes time to discuss next steps with them. And you can practice that during the practice session, the enroll practice session that you have, just to stop 5 minutes before and say, okay, what are the next steps that we need to do? Usually during practice sessions, what we have noticed at least is that you have a lot of things that you could have extra information on. Okay, discuss that at the end. So it becomes natural, basically, when you go to the FDA, that you do that at the end of the meeting. And during that last 5 minutes also, it's a summarize, basically, what you agreed with the FDA. Listen carefully to what the FDA actually says, and that's what you have to do. You can't just basically not listening and just think, oh, okay, this is what they said, the words. Look at their body language also. Sometimes the FDA says something, but you see the rest of the group thinking, oh, maybe not. So think about that, how you should react to that up front. And sometimes you can make it good. So reacting on it, asking more questions, so that everybody can speak up and come to a mutual agreement. Otherwise, you see later on in the minutes that the FDA writes that they disagree with you, whereas you thought that they all were in agreement with you. So just be careful with that. Internal dynamics and offhand remarks that they make during the meeting, just be careful with that and how you handle those. If it's only a teleconference, listen very, very careful to the voice tone. You can't do much more than that because you can't see them unless it's a video, but usually it's teleconference that they do. But listen to their voice tone and see if you think that they are agreeing with you or not. If they don't, if you think they're not agreeing, speak up and make yourself heard and let them know that you are what you think of them. This is a bit more of what I already told. Record feedback. So during the meetings, very usual to take notes. Most of the time the FDA asks you to summarize it. You send the minutes to them. Then they revise it, and that's then the official minutes that they give out. Rarely I've seen that the FDA give you a full set of minutes already before even you send it to them. So, but they have to do it within 30 days, all those minutes. So we always advise to give those minutes pretty quickly. Usually after a minute, you do a debrief with your team. You make the minutes, you send them to the FDA, and they either agree with them or they put some extra stuff in there which they think is important. And sometimes they put some extra, more general stuff at the end, which they think is important for you to have. Step number 11, I think, is one of the very important ones. Is foster a flexible and collaborative relationship with the FDA. I've seen so many good things happening for companies that have this kind of collaborative relationship with the FDA, whereas other companies that don't have that, and sometimes I don't know why they don't have it, but they don't have it. It's so much more difficult to get approvals, to get information, to work together with them. So just make sure that you have that. Typical responses are, if you don't agree with the FDA, you want to fight with them, you want to disagree with them, you pick up that. Or you say, that's not going to happen to us, and you put your head in the sand and try to ignore it. Don't. That's not the response that you should do. Communicate, work with them, so they can work with you also. Building relationships should start early. We all know that if you build a relationship with your colleagues over years, it's much easier than if you do the last 2 weeks if there's an issue. It's much more difficult. So create already that trust, the feeling of trust with the FDA early on during your development. Communicate regularly on your data, on what you're doing. Sometimes they don't even answer, but they know that you did it. FDA never forgets. Just like an elephant, they never forget. So it's some of the things that we always think, oh, they didn't read it or they didn't have it. They do. And even if reviewers change or people change in the FDA, they still know what happens previously. They have that community memory there. The last bullet here on the slide is tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It is so true for negotiations with the FDA. If you tell them one time a slightly untrue thing, they'll remember that and they don't like that. So just make sure that even if it's unpleasant, you can give your interpretation, but still give them the true data. Okay, this is more a couple of things that you could do just to connect. So don't take it personally. If it's a negative view, it's a project. It's not your personal stuff. It's a project. You work for a company, and they understand that, and they work for the FDA, and you have to understand that too. Provide answers where possible and be respectful. Prepare to change strategy. So if you set out a strategy with your team and the FDA is not in agreement with that, try to find a middle ground. Better that than to fight and make sure that you get your strategy where you wanted to have it. Find a middle ground where you both can go further. And usually that's still a very good strategy. And then this is the recap, and it's only 2 minutes after, so it's not too bad. So this is just a recap of all the steps, very clearly laid out in the book also. It's for all the meetings, and it's also for AdComs, very similar. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead. On the bottom, yeah. Press the button pretty long, Jim. Yeah, now it is.
So when you're prepping for meetings with the FDA, how long do you prep? Days, hours?
It's days usually, yes, in total. But it's a couple of hours per day. And it depends a little bit on the length that you have for the meetings. Type A is only a month or less than a month. Mm-hmm. So you have to be pretty quickly in a couple of days in a row, a couple of hours to make sure they have everything done.
And the best format, is that face-to-face or telephonically?
I would say the best format is face-to-face, sitting in the same room as the FDA, building also that relationship, especially early on, building that relationship usually goes better if you're in the same room. A telephone is nice for follow-ups, but I think those initial meetings, I think they should be face-to-face. We've seen it also in our process for the AdCom prep. We've thought about doing kickoffs by telephone, but if you want to create that feeling from, okay, we're all together in this, it's not a pleasant process, it's going to be hard work, face-to-face is doing the trick usually.
Also, in some of the meetings, you're going to have different disciplines at FDA. So you may have their preclinical, their statistical group, their clinical group, and you'll be able to see face-to-face if there's disagreement within the FDA. Mm-hmm. And that happens frequently. It's really hard to tell that on the phone because what happens is they go on mute, they discuss it amongst themselves, and they come off mute, you don't know what happened. If you're in the room, as Bert said earlier, you see the body language when the statistician rolls his eyes or her eyes, that they're just not agreeing with the clinical people, and often that is the case.
Yeah, and FDA is not very much used to poker faces, so
yeah,
you'll see what they think on their face. Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you guys. Have a safe trip home.